Okay. So this is, hey, we're actually live now. So hey guys, this is Han Solo, and yeah, my name's Robert. So Heiser, you saw some of my questions. So it's finally nice to meet you. And yeah, this is going to be great. So the format of this discussion is that Heiser will spend 90 minutes, and each person, there's 9 panelists, so each of us are going to spend 10 minutes asking Dr. Heiser some questions. And yeah, I hope that this will give glory to Jesus, and yeah, I hope it'll turn out well. So Mike, if you'd like to introduce yourself, maybe your recent content as well, like reversing Hermon, go ahead, and then we can get started.
Sure, I'm Mike Heiser. I'm currently in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. I wrote Reversing Hermon and, of course, Unseen Realm. Have a new book out now, Bible Unfiltered, which is the second collection of Bible Study Magazine articles. First one was I Dare You Not to Bore You with the Bible. I work at Logos Bible Software. Have a PhD in Hebrew and Semitic Studies, and I've been at Logos for 13 years. So I do various geeky things for them.
Yes, and is it true that you had to physically link every letter of the King James Bible in Logos?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I liked it too.
Right.
That is actually one of the more fun things I've done. So it took me a year. I devoted 2 or 3 hours a day to it. But yeah, it's true. We developed a tool where the tool displays a translation. You link every word of the translation to the word or segment in the Hebrew, Greek, and of course, in some portions, Aramaic, from which it allegedly derives. And, it just links them so that you can use what we call a reverse interlinear. You start with an English translation. You can right-click on a word and run searches on the original languages through your English. You don't even have to know you don't even have to know the alphabet, actually, to do that. You run reports on original language lemmas and grammatical forms. If you know that much, you can do grammatical searches and understand the results. But yeah, it was fun. I enjoyed it. We've got 6 of those, and I did part of another one, but I did the King James.
Right. And has Nibiru smashed into Earth today, Mike?
We haven't seen it yet here. So
well,
that's why I wasn't at my I wasn't at my laptop, because I was on my porch looking for Nibiru. So me and my pug.
Yeah, like I said in the outside chat, the pug was our shield, so probably that's why nothing's happened.
Yes, he held out his paw and successfully diverted the course of Nibiru. Yeah.
All right, let's get to our first panelist. So Richard.
No, pugs are not Nephilim. I saw that pop up.
Right.
They're better.
Yeah, Mike, if you click on if you move your mouse to the left, you'll see like a side panel appear. On the very top left, you'll see a blue box say chat. Like if you click that, then it'll give you a sidebar showing.
Okay, yeah. I just did that. Luke Elephant Walker. Oh, I get a last name there. That's wonderful. All right, I got it.
Okay, so Richard, take it away. So you have 10 minutes starting now.
Okay, thanks. It's good to meet you, Dr. Heiser. I read your book, The Unseen Realm. I liked it a lot. It changed my perspective on how I read the Old Testament and the New Testament too. So I appreciate that. I have a few questions for you. I didn't want to repeat a lot of the same questions that you get all the time. So I kind of have questions that are related to like my own theological interests, because just to see where you stand on this sort of thing. The first thing I want to ask about is Christian apologetics, because I actually came to faith through like classical apologetics, like the arguments for the existence of God and that sort of thing. So I was wondering what you thought of that sort of argument, like say the Kalam cosmological argument or Leibnizian cosmological argument. Do you have any position on those?
I don't. I'm also not I'm not opposed to evidential approaches. That's the quote unquote classic approach. In other words, I'm not, one of these dyed-in-the-wool Van Tillian presuppositionalists, that think,
right.
Showing evidence is a waste of time. I don't believe that either. So I think, ultimately, I think the Lord's going to use a variety of things to nudge people. So I don't think it's necessary to pick sides on stuff like that.
Oh yeah, I mean, I wasn't asking to pick sides. I was just wondering, like, if you had thought much about those arguments at all.
I haven't. I've read a little bit of Craig, on them. And I can usually stay with Bill, for the first 10 or 15 pages, and then he loses me. But he's, I mean, in what I can understand of it, I don't have any real, bone to pick. I'm one of these people that, I think the text affirms two sides of lots of these things, and I don't feel compelled to pick if I can sort of discern that. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't, try to reach, some resolution and talk about middle knowledge and all these other, apologetics things. I think that's fine. And I think it's useful, again, to show that you at least have a workable model that doesn't have to be, perfect. I know in the world of the philosophical apologists, they're working to, close all the doors and all the loopholes and whatnot. But to me, if it's a viable working model that, might need a little massaging here or there, that's good. I mean, that's fine. It at least shows that the idea is not incoherent.
So I have a lot of conversations with atheists on Google Hangouts. So if you were talking to one and they were to ask you, like, why are you a Christian? Why do you believe the Christian faith? And how would you persuade me to become a Christian? How would you respond to that sort of thing? Or would you even be interested in responding to that?
Well, I would say because the alternative has less explanatory power. Just going back to why do we have something rather than nothing? These causative sort of arguments, I think, that the atheist really tries to sidestep them and pretend that they're something that they're not, but they actually really are. They have a fundamental problem with avoiding the spontaneous generation of matter, and of course, guys like Hawking and physicists, they want to talk about how you need matter, but you don't need matter, and then you need it and then you don't need it, and the curvature of this, and there's no Big Bang, and this was the shape of the original. That's all bluster. Okay, at the end of the day, you have to have something that emerges from nothing. If you have something there, then we have like the eternality of matter, and you have to deny the Big Bang. And you can sidestep it by saying, well, this other thing prior existed and sort of burp this other thing into existence, and then you get an infinite regress. So I think they just have a fundamental problem. In that sort of thing, and so that's where I start. But I try to make it simple. The alternative, and you don't have to say the alternative is God. You have to say the alternative is some external cause. You could try to use neutral language there. But even if you do that, at some point you've got to talk about the external cause, and if it's a material thing, then you've got a problem.
Yeah, definitely, I agree with that. Okay, so kind of shifting gears a little, you're actually a professor at Liberty Online, right?
Yeah, I do DE for them. I've done it for about 10 years. They're 8-week modules, so I usually have a module or two.
Yeah, I'm an undergraduate at Liberty. I'm about to graduate at the end of the fall semester with a degree in theology, and I've been thinking about master's programs, and in particular, I want to find one that focuses a lot on, I guess, your area of expertise, like ancient Near Eastern studies. So I was wondering if you had any recommendations for universities that like master's in theology programs that heavily emphasized ancient Near Eastern stuff. Would you say Liberty would be a good option since you teach there?
If you're talking about, Master of Theology, you said, so that has a theological orientation. So then you're talking about seminaries. And if you're talking about seminaries, I think you could do better at a place like either Wheaton or TEDS. Trinity, that's Evangelical Divinity School, or Dallas, I think you're going to get, just there are people there that I think are good for you to be exposed to in their Old Testament departments. But if you're talking about distance, that's a little tougher. I don't know where Ted's, for instance, is at with a distance model. At the
No, I don't
level.
necessarily mean distance learning programs in general.
But I mean,
Yeah,
I'd want to take courses, from Dick Averbeck, he's at Trinity, or Walton's at Wheaton, and I have Gordon Johnson and Bob Chisholm. Chisholm's still there at Dallas. I mean, you want to get exposed to the further you go, you want to get exposed to other professors just generally, because you don't want to be sort of inbred, academically. But you also want to be able to pick not only people that you want to have some relationship with academically, but if you're thinking about doctoral work, you also need to be a little bit strategic as far as whose recommendation will matter, especially if you want to go to university.
Right.
Because universities, it's all, they're so competitive. It's really about who you know and who has a good relationship with people on the faculty. Like somebody like Walton, they're going to know professors at Hebrew Union, and in other words, the guys they had are still going to be there, and so you have a personal contact, which can help you. You'd probably get in either way, if you did good work, but having the personal connection there will help with funding. Funding is always an issue. And I had to learn that the hard way. I didn't have, I had like piecemeal scholarships a couple of times, and then I did some TA work, but I didn't really have any mentor to sort of tell me things that I should have known going in. So it matters.
Okay, so Robert said we have 2 minutes left, and I have these 2 quick questions, and I'll just ask them at the same time so you can just kind of quickly go through them. First one, I was kind of unclear about your position on this. Do you believe in justification by faith alone, as, say, a Protestant theologian would define it? And second, do you believe that taxation is theft?
Oh, that's the second one's an interesting question. Yeah. Well, I don't think taxation is theft if you have voluntary participation. In other words, the whole representation idea that you agree mutually, on not only a taxation amount, but what it goes for. So that would probably define most taxation as we have it now as theft.
Yeah.
But not in principle anyway. The other question, I would say, since I don't view works as having a participatory role in salvation, in other words, a meritorious role, yeah, I'd be on the Protestant side of that. But nowadays the justification talk is so nuanced because of Wright and others. And again, I tend to agree with, I don't know if you just saw the thing I posted on my blog about Michael Bird, that he said Wright tends to be correct in what he says, but wrong in what he denies. And I think that's actually a good thing to say, because I think he overreacts in the other direction. But I don't see any meritorious role for works at all, and so I would tend to be in the Protestant orbit of that. I think faith is what's essential.
Okay, great. I appreciate you answering all of those, and I think it's time for you to move on to the next panelist. So, Robert, go ahead.
Yeah, those are good questions. I like that last one. That was pretty fun. All right, the next one will be Jay, actually a Paltalk friend of mine that I've known for, 4 years now. And we've done a lot of interactions with Muslims on Paltalk. And so go ahead.
All right. All right, thank you. Hi, Dr. Heiser. Nice to speak with you. My questions pertain to utilizing your scholarship in an evangelistic context, witnessing to, say, Muslims, as Robert said, or religious Jews or something. And so oftentimes the question arises when in discussion with these people, finding the Trinity in, for example, in the Hebrew scriptures. And I often refer to your work on the 2 powers, or Second Temple Jewish literature that would point to some sort of plurality within God. And just one text in particular that I'd like you to comment on in Proverbs 30, verses 3-4, the knowledge of the Kedoshim and the sun. First, do you know of any Jewish literature that would connect the sun here to maybe the two powers? And second, would you yourself point to Proverbs 30 and the sun as a reference to this divine plurality, or as a foundational text for the Trinity?
Okay, what was the first part of the question again?
Are you familiar with Jewish texts that would point to Proverbs 30 as a reference to the two powers or something?
No, I'm actually not. Although I'm kind of betting that if we search through some of Boyarin's work, we might find it. But I haven't seen it pop up. Not this specifically.
Okay. And then would you yourself point to this text as something foundational for like a foundational text for the Trinity, as a reference to the sun here?
Yeah, I tend to think that. Well, let me ask you first. You're not tying the sun in with the Holy One, correct? You're just saying that the Holy One has a son.
Yeah.
I think it's hard for me to look at this and a few other verses and not see again a second person. And it's not just because of Christian stuff. Again, if you're looking at these sorts of things and you're thinking of the co-regent model. I don't know if you've read my BBR article, not the first one, but the most recent one, about how Israelite religion, my view that Israelite religion repurposes the El-Baal, relationship, that sort of thing, where Baal is El's vizier, and then they both get subsumed into Yahweh, and then we get the number two guy, the Baal imagery applied to a second person, that sort of thing. If you're thinking of things like that, again, I would say this is a legitimate trajectory to follow, for Godhead thinking. I can imagine that, others would, say either this is poetic or the sun would be, some other, element of, quote unquote Israelite in terms of them thinking that it was pagan religion and maybe attribute, sonship to the thing that is created, maybe referring to it as creation or something like that. But I just, again, it's hard for me to look at this and not see a legitimate trajectory. So I guess that's probably my best answer. I would say, yeah, this is good. This is part of building, again, the matrix for the Godhead idea. That would be my view of this anyway.
Okay, and you reference Boyer in there, and so that ties into the second question. So in light of those works that are dedicated to these topics, usually when I cite someone like Benjamin Summers or Daniel Boyarin or Alan Siegel, sometimes, again, this is not necessarily an academic discussion or debate, but just your typical, let's say, religious Jew or, Muslim or something. So they'll either respond by saying that these are liberal scholars, or that they're fringe scholars and that they don't represent the subject matter in totality. So they don't normally deal with the actual content of what these scholars say. So, for example, the religious Jew will say someone like, Rashi or Maimonides has more of a weighty opinion on these matters. Why would I go with, let's say, Boyarin or Summers? So how would you try to break through that barrier of traditionalism to these people?
Well, I have to wonder if they're using the word liberal in the same way that, some Christians would use it. Would you say they are?
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah, it's not just Boyarin and Summer. Boyarin and Summer are using rabbinic material to make their case, and so by virtue of the the whole sort of situation, when you get into rabbinic material and all this, the rabbis were not lockstep. So my question would be, why should I care if two of these rabbis didn't agree with a bunch of other ones? What makes them so special? In other words, this was a conversation, and even though Maimonides or somebody like that would not have come down on the same side, the rabbinic community for centuries considered this a legitimate conversation to have and a legitimate view to take. And they never insist that everybody agree on everything. I mean, if you read the Talmud, you know that never happens. So why are we now using this as a litmus test that we have to opt for this view over that view and pretend like the other view is some theologically aberrant liberal view, when in the ancient world it was not. So you're not, I'm not the one that writes these texts. Okay, they're old, they're ancient, they were part of the Jewish world, whether you like it or not. And the people who were living at the time thought, again, this was a legitimate conversation to have, and they took this other side. And so I don't see anything out of the gate that says that we have to agree with a couple that don't take that position. In the ancient world, there would have been plenty of others who took the opposite side. And so all Boyer and Summer are doing it. By the way, Summer, he doesn't just deal with rabbinic stuff. He's dealing with Hebrew Bible stuff and ancient Near Eastern material. So, they're using texts that were produced by people who were not only contemporaneous with these other guys, but also predate them. And it was a legitimate conversation to have. So there's nothing wrong with a conversation. It's not a liberal conversation. Okay, it's a Second Temple Jewish, late antiquity conversation. So to caricature it as liberal is to sound a bit uninformed about where the material comes from.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So the third question I have for you is just maybe in broad terms or just general terms, if you could highlight the differences that you have discovered in your work between, say, First and Second Temple Judaism, so like the ancient Israelite religion and Second Temple Judaism. You have some scholars that say you see, Zoroastrian influence in Second Temple Judaism. So what do you say about that?
Yeah, I think it depends on what they mean by that. I don't think that it's not coherent to say that and mean something like the God of the Bible didn't have, a great, adversary in Israelite thinking. Well, he certainly did. I mean, even if you abstract the adversary to being, forces in the spiritual world that create chaos, let's just be that abstract. That's there. I mean, it's there from the very beginning in the way, in the received text that we have. That's all we have. We can speculate about what was written here and there and who put this and that together, but at the end of the day, it's all speculation. Again, so I start with the received text, and as we look at that, God is working against something, okay, and that something has to be brought under control, and the something gets personified, or at least in literary terms, gets sort of portrayed as an adversarial force, pretty early. So I don't think we have to depend on Zoroastrianism to have this, good versus evil kind of thing. Going on. So if that's what's meant, I just don't buy it. If it's something like a distinct and unique, personification of evil, well, Zoroastrian influence. Okay, what do we mean by influence? Does it mean that a Zoroastrian and an Israelite bumped into each other one day and they were talking about good versus evil as specific entities, and the Israelite would look at him and say, "Gosh, I never had that thought"? Or does it mean, oh, that's really a helpful way to think about, the hostile spiritual forces against God? In other words, one presumes a category is already there. The other one presumes that like you got a blank slate. And I don't think Israelite thinkers like anybody else in the world had a blank slate. I think that would be impossible to have a blank slate if you were an Israelite. At the very least, you would have Baal. I mean, I think they had more than that. But there are very clear sort of threads that lead into this figure, that we're going to later call Satan. We're going to use Satan and personify it. That has antecedents, and the antecedents are not all traceable to Zoroastrian thought. So I think it's a little simplistic, to try to attribute, the great enemy of God, we'll just call him that, to Zoroastrianism. I think it would be equally valid to say it's not quite coherent to say that Zoroastrianism didn't have some contribution here. But I don't think the Israelites were just blank slates. Like they couldn't think independent thoughts, or they couldn't think the thoughts that everybody else was thinking. They had to wait until somebody gave them, the thoughts they have. I just think that's silly.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Jay. Yeah, so just quickly, Mike, before we go to the next person, it's interesting that when we look at Benjamin Sommer and Daniel and their work and so on, there is an unusual knee-jerk reaction against that material by those who obviously haven't actually read the material, and then they I kid you not, the terms like fringe is used in regards to not only scholars like them, but also if you're also mentioned, or even someone like John Walton is mentioned. So yeah.
Yeah, well, anybody who sort of takes it seriously and thinks, a simple thought like, well, this Christian idea probably wasn't completely novel. I don't know why that's fringy. Again, scholars live with these myths that, like I just said, that people who believe things never would have had these thoughts, had they not bumped into somebody else that had the thought first. Like, really, I mean, you have a really isolationist view of the cross-fertilization of not only ideas, but just people in the ancient world. I mean, these civilizations are not living in isolation. They're not all on islands.
Right.
They're going to run into each other, but they're also going to have, common interests, common spiritual interests, that they're going to have questions about the spirit world, that God, can God be, more than one? Can God be in more than place at one time? These are just fundamental religious questions that Summer shows that go all the way back into Mesopotamia, and you're going to find them in Egypt too. So, how people are perfectly capable of asking the same kind of questions that generate similar outcomes. I don't see why that's so novel or so fringy.
Right.
To me, it's pretty much a no-brainer.
Right. Thanks for that. So, all right, the next guest here is Hunter, and Hunter, you have 10 minutes.
Hey, Doctor. My name's Hunter. I'm from the Louisiana area, actually traveling to get a degree in biblical studies. So nice to finally get to meet you. I'm actually really excited. So just pretty much with my first question, it really has to do with the idea of Tower of Babel, because I've come into people who say that God is an evil God because he want them to have certain knowledge or whatever, so he came down and confused their languages and kind of separated them in a sense. What is the traditional view or idea of why God came down? Because when I was looking at biblical scripture, I couldn't necessarily get a super clear answer, so I was wondering if you could expound on that.
Well, I think God reacts the way that he does because there's not a consistent carrying through of the Edenic mandate, to overspread the earth. So, they're to do what you're doing at Babel, they find a plain in the land of Shinar and then they stay there, they settle there, that sort of thing. So I think that that line, gives impetus to the notion that God wanted dispersal. Dispersal was implied in the original Edenic command, that to bring the rest of the earth, into conformity, subdue it and so on and so forth. So I think that's sort of the trigger point, that there's some inconsistency, there's some disobedience there.
Okay, awesome. So my next question
I love the way God gets portrayed as an evil person because he just doesn't let people do what they want.
Yeah,
really.
I talk to people all the time about things like that, and so I never really got a full-on concrete answer, but yeah. So, but that was good though. So for my next one is the whole idea of where I've been told that that Judaism originated from polytheism and then evolved itself to like a monotheistic view over time. But I've also heard that that's like not, I've heard both sides, that it's true, that it's not true. And so looking into some scholars, like there's other opinions. So I just wanted to know your main point on that.
Well, you'd have to ask people what they mean by the evolutionary perspective. Are they referring to the biblical writers, or are they referring to the mass of Israelites? If they're referring to the latter, hey, I can imagine people in ancient Israel thought 100 different things, about God and the relationship to, other gods and all that sort of stuff, because there's no Bible, there's no systematic teaching. So it's sort of a free for all. So of course you're going to have Israelites somewhere that, worshiped other gods and thought one of them was Yahweh, and we should be good with that. And my priest complains about that. And, you're just going to have a spectrum. My gripe is with respect to the biblical writers. And this is typically where the academic debate goes. So I would suggest, I don't even know if I have them on the website. Was I allowed to do that? I have my first BBR article. It's volume 18. I have an article on divine plurality in the Hebrew Bible. And then I know this one's online, Journal for the Evangelical Study of the Old Testament. Same thing. Does divine plurality show an evolution from polytheism to monotheism? I think the idea is based entirely on circular reasoning and built on misunderstanding of really simple things. Like, you'll actually see this. Just because there's a council of plural Elohim, well, that means polytheism. Well, really? Because to say that, you have to assume that the writer is using Elohim and of these different beings, and they all are essentially interchangeable. They all essentially have the same attributes, that sort of thing. In other words, they assign attribute characteristics to the term, and then they say, see, we have polytheism. Again, I really doubt that any biblical writer would look at 1 Samuel 28:13 and see the deceased of a human dead as on par with the God of Israel. I really doubt that. You'd have to be more or less insane to think that thought. But that's what you're required to think if you think that the word Elohim used in plurality means polytheism. But no, but honestly, people just don't examine stuff like that. And then you get these Second Temple people, like that just pick up this banner and they run with it. God has a council, so that must be polytheism. They had councils too. Well, hey, guess what? If we evolve toward monotheism, and by the time of Deutero-Isaiah, we have this glorious breakthrough to monotheism, and now we have to be really, really careful. We got to go back and edit the Hebrew Bible and take all this plurality language out. And it's against the rules now to use divine plurality. Well, again, I have an article that I know this is available because I put it on my blog. I was allowed to. Divine plurality in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are 160 references to plural Elim or Elohim in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And these were not liberals. Okay, these people thought that the Pharisees were compromisers. Okay, they didn't get the memo. So you have, and a lot of these are in divine council scenes. So it's a myth. It's a myth, that plural Elohim in a council means polytheism. Okay, because the Qumran people were not polytheists, and nobody says that. Again, that would be an insane claim. But if you apply the same criteria that people in Israelite religion in that area use, and you apply it to Qumran, it shows the absurdity of that particular criterion. And that's what I do in my dissertation. It's like, look, these people aren't getting the memo. The term must mean something else. They were fine with the council of other Elohim at Qumran. Why do we look at that and say, oh yeah, that's okay. We're not calling them polytheists, but then we look at the same thing in the Hebrew Bible and we call them polytheists. Well, I'll tell you why we do it. Because we want Israelite religion, specifically here, the biblical writers. We want biblical thought to go through the same process of evolution that we see other civilizations go through, or that we imagine they went through. To lower them and basically put everything on the same level. It's an anthropological sort of argument. That's why we do it. So, honestly, they just don't care about the data. You'll see absurd things about Carol Newsom, and she's a good scholar, but she's so easy to target here. She does this work on the Shabbat Shirot, the songs of the Sabbath sacrifice of Qumran. This is where you get a lot of these weird divine council scenes with Elim running around all over the place. She refers to them as angelic Elim. Why does she do that? Because she's married into a system that says by the time we hit Deutero-Isaiah, the gods had become angels. There isn't a single verse in the Dead Sea Scrolls where Elohim are defined as Malachim. Not a single one. So her verbiage there is entirely not data-driven. She has just bought into an idea, a trajectory, and then she makes the data conform to the trajectory. And you see that all the time. So, I think for the biblical writers, this idea that the biblical writers were at one time, polytheists, and then they sort of had to, put the brakes on and change to monotheism, I think is just nonsense.
Okay, well, that was really good, actually. That kind of covered it all.
I would say get the first BBR article, volume 18, and the JESOT article, and then the Tyndale Bulletin thing you can get on. You could probably get all of those on my website.
Okay.
And that'll give you, the why I'm saying what I'm saying.
Okay, sweet. I'll definitely get that. So for my final question, this is just kind of more on a personal note, just from since I have this chance. But what? Okay, so pretty much just my question is, what got you through to getting your PhD? Because I myself am striving to one day get a PhD, so I was just seeing if you could get some good mentoring, help there with me.
Well, my experience was a bit. You could fill up 2 hours, with my experience of this, because it was a bit aberrant. My piece of advice, if you were going to the University of Wisconsin at Madison, the Hebrew department, when I was going there, is the best thing I can tell you is refuse to die. Just refuse to die. Make them kick you out. Do not quit. Just refuse to die. And we had a grad school is supposed to be difficult. It is not supposed to be cruel and capricious, but that's what mine was. It's hard, to sort of give somebody a piece of advice from personal experience other than that. I mean, literally what got me through was I just will not quit. We had people kicked out of our department every semester I was there for 9 years. You say, well, why'd they let them in? I don't know, maybe just to kick them out. I don't like your paper, you're gone. And just really, I'll give you one story, okay? I'll give you one story, and I'm not going to name the professor, and I'm gonna pick one that happened while I was, out of the classroom. I was a dissertator. But this guy now that is telling the story is a pretty up and coming Hebrew scholar, so he made it. But they had a class on wisdom literature, and the first semester you covered Job and biblical stuff. The second semester you cover some extra biblical stuff. So at the end of the term, end of the semester, they go in for the final exam. 5 or 6 of them. They sit around the table. The professor hands out the exam, and he notices 5 minutes later that nobody has written a thing. And he said, "What's wrong?" And one brave soul says, "Well, you gave us the exam for the second semester. This is the first semester. So it's the wrong exam." So instead of walking 20 feet down the hall and getting the correct exam, he says, "Well, you take this one, just do the best you can." Nobody's ever seen any of the material. Everybody flunks. And then he has a conniption, sends everybody an email and says, "I want everybody back in my office, like today." And so everybody goes back to his office, and he reams everybody out. And he says, "Here's what we're going to do. In 24 hours, we're going to meet back here, and you're going to retake the exam." So what do? They all get together, all the students, and they say, "Look, we don't have a prayer, of being, ready for this, and they go back and forth. And then the question pops into their heads, "Now, wait a minute. If he gives us the correct exam, we've all studied for that. But will he give us the same wrong exam?" And they're at a dilemma. And so what they decided to do was they bet that he would give them the same wrong exam. They split up the text among them. They all did all-nighters. Each one of them studied a particular text and then photocopied their notes and gave them to everybody else. They came in the next day, and sure enough, he gave them the same wrong exam. That's hazing. That's just arrogance and hazing. And most of my experience was like that. So, you know, you're going to have a better experience no matter where you go. I would say find a department that is not cutthroat. What I mean by that is you do not accept any acceptance of an offer until you talk to the students that are in the department. You know, it was agonizing for us to see new students come in because we knew what they were going to experience. And you know, I've had students of my own that I know could do well ask me for a recommendation to the department I went into, and I've never given one of them to go somewhere else. You know, I don't want to be responsible for you moving your family, quitting your job, you know, whatever it is, your ministry, or, you know, whatever your circumstances are. You come here and somebody doesn't like you, and then you're gone. You know, I don't want that on my conscience. So I would say one of the best things you can do, other than, again, try to get good references and people who know people and increase your chances for funding, is talk to students that are already in the program. They've been there for a year or two. What is it like? And you're looking for professors that are not cruel, and you're looking for students that just sort of, you know, they're in each other's corner. You know, it's a friendly competition environment. It's wonderful if you can get professors that are really in your corner, that want you to come out and want to prepare you, you know, for publication and prepare you to, you know, hit the job market. The job market is brutal. That's another thing I can tell you. It is brutal, with all capital letters. So you need to have a backup plan, but those kind of things are just absolutely essential. If you're married, don't have kids. No, we actually had, you know, a couple kids, you know, while we were in it, but you know, I have an exceptional wife, but I worked full time too, so that she could stay home with the kids. Everything about my experience is atypical. I worked 40 or 50 hours a week. It had to be kept a secret, or I would have been kicked out of the department for that, because you're not supposed to be able to do that. But I had to. I didn't have any other choice. You know, so it was a chess match. My whole doctoral experience was a chess match up to the very last day. I'm gonna cheat here and give you one more story. This is my own now. It's the last day of my doctoral experience. I had to do some crazy things just to get my advisor to sign my degree. Again, he was just playing with me, but I got the signature. I walked outside the door, and across the street is the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. I walk through the door. You have an appointment that you have to schedule with the dean where you deposit your dissertation. I walk into her office, and she's just this wonderful, happy little Asian lady, just the perfect person at the end of the road. She's so glad to see you. I sat down, handed her the box. She flipped the lid open and said, I've never met her before, okay? She flips the lid open and says, oh, Hebrew and Semitic studies. Congratulations, you survived. And I looked at her like, oh, that's just kind of spooky. And she says, oh, we know all about Hebrew and Semitic studies. They're being watched. Okay. I mean, from the day I got in to the moment I handed the dissertation in, it was a chess match. Don't get into that environment. Just don't do it. Ask questions.
Got it.
Okay, I'm done. I could go on for 2 hours with the crazy stuff that my department did to people. It's awful.
But no, that's real helpful though. So I appreciate it a lot. And thank you so much.
So I do not fear critics. Okay. It could be a whole lot worse. I could still be in the program. Okay.
Yeah. I actually remember you. This is, I think, back in what was his name? Oh, that's right, Guy Malone.
Yeah.
He would organize those UFO conferences, and I remember you back in the day when you were debunking Sitchin. Love that. When it comes my turn, I'll speak about that. But yeah, you did mention that when people would come in with papers, like I think you mentioned a girl came in with a paper, and then she cried.
Yeah, we have to make her cry. Yeah. Oh boy. It just shouldn't be that way. You should have a mentoring relationship. Get somebody that's excited about your research, and of course that person, that your advisor, is going to be there. He's not going to retire. He or she's not going to retire. But you got to have a department where it's hard enough that you shouldn't feel like you're in a manhunt or something. You shouldn't do that. You got to have a better environment.
All right, Wayne, it's your turn, bro.
Can you hear me?
I heard a little bit of a voice. Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. Perfect. Let me turn my camera on.
Bandwidth issue.
Hopefully you can see me. Can you guys hear me and see me?
Yep.
All right. So first of all, it's nice to meet you, Dr. Heiser. I've been conversing with you over email for the last couple of months. We were supposed to have an interview like 2 months ago or something like that. And then the next month, I think you forgot about it. And then you emailed me and you said, "Do we have an interview today?" And I said, "We actually don't, but we can set something up." And so now we're here.
Okay.
But it's nice to meet you. I'm Wayne Fillmore. And what my first question to you is actually, we discussed this over email. I wanted to talk about the significance of today being that the world as we know is supposed to end.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, we're still here. No, it's not going to. We actually just recorded I wonder if I haven't checked the email today, but I'm just wondering if it's up now. But we did a podcast episode yesterday on why the world didn't end on September 23rd. I don't think there's anything, let not your heart be troubled. I don't think there's any basis for any of this thinking, both in terms of astronomy with the Nibiru Planet X stuff, or biblical thinking. And so that episode we went through why. We can get into that stuff if you want to, but no, I'm not expecting anything to happen today.
Well, thank God. Another question I do have for you is, I'm familiar with your work from Unseen Realm, and is that the material where you basically make the notion? You say that as far as the other like ancient myths and stories about gods, there does seem to be some credibility towards their stories. I think you
well,
that notion.
I use a lot of ancient Near Eastern material. I mean that topic specifically, really isn't like a focus point in the book, but I use ancient Near Eastern material all over the place in the book. Again, this isn't a terribly profound thought, but everybody in the ancient world, whether it's ancient Near East or somewhere else, they all have fundamental questions. It's a very human thing. How did I get here? What's the point? Is there something, other than me out there? They look at the stars and wonder about that. And, everybody has the same questions about, are there higher powers? Is there something, greater out there in terms of, intelligence and whatnot? So the ancient people aren't any different than now. They're wondering these questions, and they all have, again, some some orientation about there's this world and there's the world of the gods, and what might that world be like. And again, they make some basic assumptions, I think, that, hey, we don't like to live chaotic lives. We like when, we have enough to eat, when things are in order, and so on and so forth. So, gods are intelligent beings. They probably like that too. So we speak about the gods, and this includes scripture, we use these metaphors of family and counsel. Again, I think they're important, especially when they're mediated to us in scripture. I do think scripture is something, beyond, other ancient Near Eastern literature, but it's also part of the same, regional corpus, if you will, shared worldview, because God picked people to write. People live at certain times, places, they have certain cultures, and these are God's choices. So I expect similarity. I expect people to be asking the same sorts of questions. So in that sense, what ancient people are thinking about and expressing, you use the word validity. Okay, I don't accept all of their truth, or even most of their truth claims or truth propositions. And a lot of times they don't even lay them out. They just sort of assume things. But when it comes to, again, this impulse, this notion of a spiritual world and an ordered spiritual world, and that also means competition between the personalities, if you will. I think there's validity to that, because if we just take scripture off the board for a moment, or off the table, if we do have greater intelligences than us, it stands to reason that they wouldn't all agree, that there will be competition, that they will have a spectrum of relationships between each other. There will be competition for power and influence, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, what the ancient Near Eastern person produces is pretty normal. It's expected. It's a manifestation of the things they're thinking about. And what they're thinking about isn't so strange. The way they express it might sound strange to our ear, but at the end of the day, they're asking the same questions as anybody else would.
That takes me into my next question I have for you. I think this would be my last one. I had a couple of months back, I had emailed you, and you probably may not remember this, but I had emailed you a quick explanatory, I guess you could say, model I had for the Nephilim. And at first I had certain views about the Nephilim, and what I tried to do is I tried to falsify those beliefs to the best of my abilities, and I actually did. So I think my belief was kind of more, you could say, fundamentalist, thinking about the Nephilim. They were 12 feet or 20 feet tall, they were really big, etc. And as I kept on digging and trying to find things that would falsify my beliefs on that, come to find out there were big people who lived 50,000 years ago, but they weren't 12 or 20 feet tall, they were 6 feet tall, and etc. And so my question is it more reasonable for Christians to just accept that the Nephilim story, it could have been true, but it was more, or at least exaggerated?
Well, I would say, well, if we go with the biblical description of Nephilim, and you actually get Goliath and one other that have any sort of height attribution, you're within the 6 to 8 foot range. In Goliath's case, you'd have to be reading the Dead Sea Scrolls to stay within that range. And I think, based upon, again, the scholarly comparisons of the Samuel texts in the Masoretic text and the Septuagint with the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think that is the proper reading. So that one little notation about cubits and spans with Goliath is part of a much wider net when it comes to the whole text critical issue of the books of Samuel. So I don't think that is an exaggeration. I mean, you would have had isolated people who, when you're living at a time when the average male height is about 5.5 feet tall, and you get somebody that's 7 feet tall, or pushing 8 feet, Manute Bol or something like that, somebody that's Yao Ming, really exceptionally tall. Well, I mean, the comparison would be so exaggerated that what else would you call that person? You might refer to them as a giant. You might, think that there's something going on there because it's so unusual. And ancient people oftentimes associated unusual attributes, with either a curse from the gods or a blessing from the gods or divine parentage or something like that. So what you actually see in the Bible is really not I wouldn't use the word exaggeration. I think it's, it's pretty normative. Again, you have these isolated individuals that are unusual. And if you get, if you get any sort of inbreeding, interbreeding or whatever, not in terms of a freakish, kind of thing, but, you marry up the traits, so to speak, you can get, people groups, families, that emerge that have, unusual height. So it's not really that abnormal. I think the better question, and maybe what you're actually asking, or what other people have been interacting with you about, is do we take a story like the Nephilim and do we interpret it literally, or do we interpret it mythically? And I think the mythic hermeneutic is something that's fundamentally misunderstood by Christians because of the way that a term like myth gets used. Can everybody hear me?
Oh yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I just lost the tab for a second there, but I think it gets fundamentally misused because when we hear the word myth, we think of fairy tales. In academic discourse, even though you might have writers that think of the term that way, mythic just means that you're dealing with a piece of literature in which God or divine beings are major characters in the story. That's a mythic story. So in that sense, the Bible is certainly mythic. But as Tolkien, I think it was Tolkien famously said, it's the myth that is true. When you have supernatural beings as foundational characters in a story, that's what it is literarily. And so you'd have to decide, okay, are the people of the day, are they looking at some of these unusual people and they're making sort of mythic assumptions about them, about their unusual physical features? So that's a question that some would have to deal with, and struggle with. But when you really think about it, we do mythic interpretation of our own lives every day. If I'm looking for a job, and I've been looking for a job for months, and I all of a sudden, I have a job now, and let me tell you the story. I was looking for months, and I went into the grocery store, and I bumped into this person, that I knew, and they happened to be with somebody else that they knew, and that person ran a business, and they were looking for somebody, to replace somebody that had just left, and we find out in conversation that our skill sets really overlapped, and this guy wound up hiring me. Look how the Lord was in that. Okay, what we've done is we've taken real circumstances in real life, and we've assigned by faith a spiritual meaning to that. We see God in the details. We see God in the events. That's mythic interpretation. That's all that is. And it doesn't mean it's false. I mean, if we believe that there's a God, if we believe there's a God who loves us and is an intelligent being, and again, all these things that collectively we look at as our Christian faith, which ultimately stem from the question I was asked early on, why are you a Christian? Again, because the alternative has less explanatory power, ultimately. And I would even add to that, because the Christian gospel is the only one that makes sense. Every other system has imperfect people trying to be perfect to please a perfect creator. It's just absurd. These works-based systems, these ritual-based systems, they're self-defeating across the board. So, you fit that story, me telling that story about how I got this job, and I see God in the details. Does that mean that it's just a product of my imagination? Well, no, how can we say that? If we believe that God is real, of course God was there. Maybe we didn't parse every part of the story correctly, but God was in there, okay? He's in there, and he's doing things, he's influencing people, he's putting us in situations where by providence we take the left turn instead of the right turn, and we wind up with this or that outcome. So should we approach Old Testament story that way? Should we approach other biblical story that way? Are the biblical writers seeing God in historical events? And then this is what comes out, again, under the providence of God. This is what they produce in writing. This is how they see God in the events. Well, you could certainly look at Scripture that way. It produces the question of, well, were the biblical writers right in every detail? Again, how would we know? We can say by faith that, okay, providence, says that, whatever they wrote, that that turns out to be correct. Again, I'm not arguing for this view or against this view. I'm just saying this is a view that has a solid grounding in supernaturalism and the reality of God, the reality of Christ, that we don't, we're not deists. God is active in our lives, and is this a filter through which we could understand Scripture? Well, maybe to me there someone who would, and I know people like this, that this is their model. They are supernaturalists. This is their model. They probably couldn't shoehorn that into a traditional view of inspiration or inerrancy, but at the end of the day, they believe in the Scriptures, they believe in Christ, and this is how they parse certain things in the Bible. And I'm not going to throw stones at them for doing that. I think they're trying to honor the reality of God and Christ and what they have in Scripture, and they're doing their best to understand it. So I don't look at them as black hats. I look at them as white hats. I don't have to agree with every position they have. At the end of the day, I'm just glad they're believers. So I don't stress out too much over, well, I wouldn't look at this passage this way like you do. Okay, maybe that's true, but honestly, oh well.
Thank you, Dr. Heiser. Thank you for your time.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So we have another Mike in the room, Mike Winger. So it's your turn, and go ahead.
I see lots of books behind you. Where are you at? Are you in grad school or?
No, I'm at home.
Okay.
That's just, yeah. I don't read those. I just put them there for the sake of how they look behind me. My name is Mike Winger. I'm in LA. My church is Hosanna Christian Fellowship in Bellflower, and I have a YouTube channel with my name, Mike Winger, like a bird. Okay. And I got a few questions for you. I got 4 questions, so I'll try to get through all of them. Okay. And I really appreciate you taking the time to spend with us today. Really grateful for that. The first one is, what do you think are the essential truths of the Christian faith?
I think the essential truths are salvation by grace through faith. Works, we have no merit to bring to the table with respect to salvation. That involves the work of the cross. I do think atonement, I believe in substitutionary atonement. Doesn't mean that other aspects of the atonement, aren't valid. I don't feel compelled to pick a view of the atonement. I think they all have something worthwhile to say. It's a multifaceted thing. But usually when people would gravitate to one of the other views, they do it to get rid of substitution. I think that's wrong. To me, those are the fundamental things. Now, you could ask yourself, well, could you have somebody who's like a oneness Pentecostal, and can they still be a Christian? I think so. I think if Christ is the lone object of salvation, and they're clear about, what he did on the cross as being the exclusive, means of salvation, their works don't have anything to do with it. I think they can be messed up on, Trinitarianism or Christology or whatever. And still be a believer, and that's not a novel position. That's kind of been an old position, all the way back through church history. So I think at the end of the day, it's the story of the cross and parsing that correctly are the core things.
All right. My second question is, what do you think are the most important apologetic issues right now? But I want to ask it kind of on two sides. One would be apologetic issues within the church, and then second, apologetic issues outside of the church.
Boy, within the church. Apologetics is so broad, so I guess I need to think, broadly here. I think that the gender and the transgender issue will be a big deal. It is, and it will continue to be a big deal in the church. I think the propensity, at least it seems to me, the propensity to redefine the gospel in terms of social justice is a huge issue. I mean, that's our identity right there. And along with that, pluralism, I think, will still be a big issue. Outside the church, there are lots and lots of things that I wish more Christians were thinking about. but they get distracted by other things. I think transhumanism is a huge issue. I think synthetic biology, nanotechnology, all of these sorts of things are just looming on the horizon to crush the faith of many if they're not thought about well. I think the neurotheology, again, the whole issue of consciousness, I would put in the same category. That these are things that Christians need to think about very carefully and very well, and frame the discussion in a meaningful way and an honest way as well, and not be persuaded that they're not allowed to do that. We are allowed to do that. Okay, we're thinking people just like anybody else. But those things that I just mentioned, they get to the core of, and they're going to get to the core. When we get serious about creating humans from scratch, through synthetic biology and mixing genetic material, the powers of nanotechnology, such as they are, all these things they're already married together, but the marriage is going to be even tighter. And so it takes us into what is a human. That's even bigger than what's gender. How do we think about ourselves? Should we be going down these trajectories? Are we really trying to be as gods? Should we do that? Isn't that the Edenic vision, Mike? Isn't that the Edenic vision that we should get rid of disease and, death is unnatural? Shouldn't we be pursuing these things? Isn't this our divine destiny, to be as gods, to get rid of, to restore the human condition, the human planet to Eden, to Edenic-like state? That power is within our grasp if we, pursue all these things to their terminal point. All those things raise theological issues and obviously significant ethical issues. So I think those are a big deal.
And you say that I'm a youth pastor. I've dealt with the issue of possible cloning, things like that with our youth. We do like Q&A, and they're the ones bringing up these questions.
Yeah.
And so we wrestle with them and talk about them, and I think that they find comfort in the fact that we're allowed to think about these issues.
Well, and the question of if extraterrestrial life is a big one. That's a paradigm changer, even though it wouldn't necessarily have to be. If we discovered intelligent extraterrestrial life, well, then it's an automatic, paradigm changer for a lot of people. But to me, that goes back to a poor understanding of the image of God. I wouldn't be troubled by it, but I think most of the church would be terribly troubled by it because they're thinking about, hey, is my favorite latte on sale at Starbucks this week? And they're not thinking about transhumanism, the way you would, as a youth pastor and somebody interested in apologetics, you have your head in this stuff. Most Christians don't. But your youth are going to get a steady diet of this pretty much every week, online, popular movies, TV shows, these are all big themes. So it doesn't surprise me at all that they're coming up with the questions.
Yeah. Okay, I have another question here. What in your mind, I'm trying to think how to word this correctly, but I've envisioned in my mind, as a pastor, like what kind of variety of people would I be comfortable with fellowshipping at a church that I pastor? Mm-hmm. And so my question to you is, what issues are not worth dividing over in the sense that all these people should be able to fellowship together?
Yeah, well, the first thing you run into there is my list is not going to be the same as anybody else's list in the groups. So it has a great potential to implode from the beginning. I do have to think about this a lot because, of different media opportunities that I'm asked to do, and should I do this and should I not do that, and it's a little bit different, in a church. But there are a number of sort of silly things that if you have, I would say even something that's not terribly silly, if you have someone in your church that just can't fellowship with you or anybody else because, let's say, they're not a Calvinist. Okay, well, you can put that on the nice list all you want, but that person's going to make it an issue of division. So I would say at close to the top of the list are not having divisive people people that division just floats their boat. I mean, this is what they're about. They're insecure and they need the conformity of ideas to feel accepted and welcome and comfortable. Whatever their insecurity is due to is obviously a whole different issue, but just the issue of division itself, I think, is something that we need to be very wary of and keep out of our own fellowship community. And I'm not saying you just write the person off the first time, but if this is a pattern of their life and they literally just need and want and believe that they're contending for the faith that everybody else needs to think like them, that is just poison. So I think that's a big deal. But as far as like issues, I go back to the core ideas of the gospel. Do you understand what the gospel is? Okay, do you understand what the gospel isn't? That has to be right near the top of the list, because if you can look at the person who disagrees with you and understand that this person is in the family of God right next to you. This might be a little Pollyannish, but that ought to make you treat the person well, even when you disagree with them. Amen. And if you can do that, that takes a lot of things off, or it leaves a lot of things on the table. The creation thing, the eschatology thing. Even if people are struggling with the role of works in the Christian life, again, the point to zero in on there is merit. I try not to talk to any Christians about faith and works. I try to get them to think of the struggle as faith versus merit. I change the work to merit, because even if they're thinking, well, God doesn't like me as much now anymore because I went off and did this sin. Well, if they realize that, okay, you're right, that which cannot be obtained by moral perfection cannot be lost by moral imperfection. I get that. They can still be troubled, they can still struggle, and they can still have questions, but at least they understand the gospel. But if they're in there talking about how, hey, we can be perfected and perfectibility, and we've all got to do this, we got to have these ducks in a row, and the rest of you are going on your way to hell because you don't see the role of this behavior or that behavior. Again, that's poison. So I think the gospel is really the core to that. But you can have that all worked out in your head, and the people you're wishing had it worked out in their head, they can be viewing you like as Judas Iscariot. So it's tough.
Okay, this is to me a really important question, because I think it will apply to a lot of the people some of the people who really follow your work. So here's the question: what advice would you give to a believer who has some uncommon views, and it's hindering them in fellowshipping in a local congregation with a local group of people?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would try to convince them that this thing that you really value, this doctrinal position or whatever, this interpretation of a passage, again, is peripheral and subservient to the centrality of the gospel. In other words, it's not a hill to die on. This is not die. If you die for this cause, are you really dying for your faith? Well, not really. You're dying for this position. Okay, positions on interpretations of specific passages are not the faith. Now, they may have tethered their idea to the gospel. They may be defining what it means to be a Christian by, okay, we have to believe in the flat earth now or something. That's what it means to have a high view of Scripture. We can't be Christians if we don't have a high view. All this concatenation of logic that they go to. So I would say, again, try to say, well, you can have this position. It can be important to you, and we're gonna try to honor its importance to you. But to really, be here and not be divisive, because Scripture is very clear that we shouldn't be divisive. To avoid that, you need to see this as secondary to the gospel itself, and just try to get them to separate some of the links that they've created in their head, without necessarily attacking the idea that you might sit there and think, dude, you don't have a prayer being correct here. But instead of attacking that, try to sever some of the links so that they can distinguish between something that's truly essential and something that is related but not that thing. These two things are related, but they are not the same thing.
Awesome. Thank you very, very much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Just a quick question for Luke. Luke, do you have to go anywhere? Do you have a curfew, or can I? Because I think Christian Man needs to go soon, so I might pass it to him.
Well, I just got my mic back, so if I can go right after Christian Man, that'll be fine.
Okay. All right, Christian Man, go ahead.
Oh, Michael Heiser. I know you from your documentary that you were in, Ancient Aliens Debunked. Thought that was a great documentary. I do have a couple questions for you. Your favorite book in the Bible and your favorite verse.
Oh boy, that's really an interesting question. Favorite book, I probably still have to say Genesis. Just lots of stuff to think about in Genesis. Favorite verse? No, it's not Genesis 6:4. I would. Yeah, that is really that's a challenging question. I often do. I sign a lot of books with Jeremiah 32:27 because my mind does get taken back to that quite a bit. When in different circumstances, it's "Behold, I am the Lord, the God of all flesh. Is anything too hard for me?" So to me that's a great statement. It's a great thing to remind ourselves of. I also like the passage in Corinthians. This is kind of obscure, but it's the one about let's see here. I always get this passage confused with another one here. It's the part where Paul says, that we were.
Oh!
What was that?
Oh, I think.
Are we?
Oh, come on!
We're still on, right?
Yeah, I'm still on.
Whoa! Hold on. What is going on?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Keep muted, man.
It's 2 Corinthians 1:9, right around there. It's where Paul says, "Indeed, we had felt that we had received the sentence of death, but that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead." I love the turn of phrase there. We felt that we had received the sentence of death, and that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on the one who raises the dead. So, again, you could probably tell by those two verses that I must be a depressed person. I've got to remember that there's nothing too hard for the Lord, and here we are. We're feeling like we're going to die, but God will raise the dead. And I'm not a depressed person, but I'll tell you what, I thought about those verses a lot during graduate school, and I'm not trying to be funny there, because it was, I had 15 years of working full time through 2 master's degrees and a PhD, and it was difficult. But I did it because I felt this is what I'm supposed to do. And, look at Jeremiah, look at Paul. They made it. I shouldn't complain. I don't like complainers. So I think those two are favorites.
Thank you. What is your favorite documentary you were in?
Boy, was I in more than one? We did the Ancient Aliens Debunked thing. We did the Aliens and Demons thing. I honestly like the Ancient Aliens Debunked. But it's not that I don't like the other one, but I think there's just a lot of good content in that. So I would have to say that one. I mean, I'm only picking 2 here. But I try not to do TV based upon my History Channel experience. I'm assuming you guys know that whole story. But I don't trust television, although I'm going to be doing some TV in November through something on the Discovery Science Channel. And since it's not about ancient aliens, I feel like I can trust them. But generally, I try to avoid it.
What are your objections when people say that the sons of God in Genesis 6 were Seth's line?
Well, I would say that Peter and Jude disagree. I think that's a fundamental problem, because they reference the angels that sin. They link it to the time of Noah and the flood. There's also a link in Jude to the sexual nature of the sin, but you don't even need the details. There is no other group of angels that sinned in the Old Testament. And everybody think, well, what about the Satan taking a third of the angels with him? Again, that's a myth. There is no passage like that in the Old Testament. The only time in the Bible you ever get the term third linked with angel or angels is in the last book of the Bible. That's Revelation. And there it's clearly in conjunction with the war in heaven that results from the birth of the Messiah. Again, it's a passage about the powers of darkness, again, trying to oppose the establishment of the kingdom of God, the birth of the Messiah and his resurrection and ascension. It has nothing to do with some primeval rebellion in the Old Testament. So who are the angels that sinned? Well, you got one candidate. So you've got a fundamental disagreement with Peter and Jude. The other problem with it, and I put this on the same level, even though it's a little bit more esoteric, is that if you're going to interpret what's going on in Genesis 6 as the line of Seth, then you don't have a prayer of interpreting the passage in its own original context. And so I don't ever want to hear you talk about interpreting the Bible in context again, because you've just terminated the discussion about context. And most people don't realize the context is the Mesopotamian Apkallu story. They don't have access to that material. They've never been told that this material even exists. So it's very clear that Genesis 6, 1-4 is responding to Babylonian religion, specifically the story of the Apkallu, and every element of Genesis 6, 1-4, the divine beings, before the flood, after the flood, you got, divine and human, combination, you've got giants. Every element of Genesis 6, 1-4 can be found in the Apkallu stuff from Mesopotamia, without exception. And so it's very clear to anyone who looks at the material and looks at the context of the passage that, what we have going on here is that the writer's thinking in supernatural terms. So to get the line of Seth, you have to essentially turn all that off and ignore it. That's why I say I don't ever want to hear you talking to me about interpreting the Bible in context again, because you're not willing to do it. So that's what I would say. And then I'd usually get asked to leave or just to shut up or whatever. So, you're not winning hearts and minds, I guess.
I have a quick question on this, if you don't mind, Christian.
Really quickly, though, do you think the dumbing down of Bible teaching has caused a lot of people to leave Christianity or become apostate?
I do, because it makes them easy prey for bad thinking that is antagonistic to the Bible and to Christianity. It just makes them easy targets.
For example, really quickly.
Well, boy, there's so many examples. I mean, let's just go, with something like the Synoptic Gospels. Okay. Well, the Synoptic Gospels don't all agree, like they're different wording and different order of events, and some events aren't in this story and they're in the other story. And again, because we've been taught that the Bible is somehow doesn't involve the human writers, they're just sort of there for window dressing. And the Bible's really either about God whispering every word in the writer's ear, or plugging the divine USB into the head and downloading the content as though the writer, isn't responsible. Again, just what I refer to as an X-Files view of inspiration. Viewing inspiration as a paranormal event that doesn't involve human thought and activity and skill. When you're taught to think about the Bible that way, then things like the Synoptic Gospels or any sort of editorial activity just destroys you. How can that happen under inspiration? Again, you're only thinking about inspiration one way. This, again, what I think is sort of a cartoonish way to look at it. And that just sets the Bible up to fail. And it makes people vulnerable to all sorts of dumb arguments that instead of seeing that they're dumb arguments, they come across as compelling in some way, and people give up their faith. I mean, I get emails like this all the time. I meet people at conferences that they tell me why they leave the faith, and I don't say this to them, but I'm thinking, man, that is a dumb reason. Tell me something about personal pain, and then I'll understand that. But what you've just told me is just a dumb reason. to jump ship, and it really bothers me. I think a lot of it can be laid at the feet of just people not being taught to think well.
Heiser, thank you for answering my questions. I'm sorry for the background.
Oh, that's okay.
Bear for you to answer my questions.
Yeah,
You're welcome.
someone in the outside chat actually. One sec, I'm getting feedback from. Okay, Eric Johnson from the Naked Bible Facebook group. He says, "Don't you realize that that's the sound of the end of the world?" Because it's connected to today, and so maybe Nibiru is affecting Christian man at the moment. So
maybe that's it. Hey, Maury, has Nibiru shown up yet? Raise both paws. Both paws.
The giant Nephilim has come down to destroy my house.
Yeah.
And Mike, the secret question that Trey set up for the Facebook group, he says, "What's Mike's last name?" So I put in Dr. Psalm 82. I was thinking that would be your favorite passage. So.
No, I mean, it was a watershed event, but when I think about that, I just need to get mentally reoriented. That I want this to happen, or we're between a rock and a hard place here. The places I go are those other two. That just helps me. Creates perspective.
All right. So Luke, you are next, and yep, go ahead. You have 10 minutes.
Hello. Okay. Hello. Can you hear me?
I can hear you faintly.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah, I've tried to boost Luke. So Luke, I've tried to boost your voice. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Is this
You distant from a mic, man?
This is
right in front of my face.
Batman with a lightsaber. That's interesting. It'd be better than the last. Well, not Rogue One. I loved Rogue One, but it would be better than the one previous to that. So, yeah, I'd pay to see that.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I think my mic is jacked up.
It's better now.
Okay. So anyway, so I'm an engineering student at Texas A&M, and I've been following your work for about a year or a year and a half or so, and it's really probably the single most transformative literature that I've read related to how much I've changed my views on things. So I posted 2 of my questions there in the outside chat, and I think I worded them better there. The first one is to the Watchers. Whenever I was reading Reversing Herman, it's that the main sin there was that they were giving knowledge to human beings, and I was curious how that would interact with like the spirit of knowledge that's promised from Yahweh and things like that.
Yeah, I take phrases like that as really being about discernment and not so much content knowledge. And and with respect to the Watchers, I mean all of these things can be neutral. For instance, the metallurgy thing. Well, hey, the Israelites made weapons too. Does that mean they were evil? Again, it just depends on the use of those things, and how they do they displace the Lord as what you're really trusting in. Do they lead to idolatry, things like that? So, but more germane to your question, spirit of knowledge and things like that. I think that's really about discerning between something sinister and something godly, or truth and error, discernment.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, the sin was not necessarily them giving helpful knowledge, but it was more along the lines of transgressing divine boundaries.
Well,
would that be?
I don't think there's any intention that they had any intention to be truly helpful in a godly way. What becomes the concern in Second Temple thinking, and we'll include some Israelite thinking here as well, is that what was given and how can I put this? The mindset that parses things this way, would think thoughts along these lines. That, okay, we're people, And we have, again, hostile, forces, hostile spiritual forces. And these forces are at work in these specific areas, in the case of the Watcher story, in terms of content knowledge of various things, or things that will, again, produce immorality. So the way people are parsing this is that humanity is terribly evil, not because of just the fall. Yes, the fall shows that we can sin, that we will be self-centered, we will rebel. But we have spiritual forces at work that are deliberately trying to turn our hearts away from the true God and help us destroy ourselves more effectively. And so I don't look at it, and neither did Second Temple Judaism, as saying, "Oh, these are good guys. They're really trying to be helpful," and it's the people that just mess things up. They're not giving that much credit to the Watchers. They're viewing this as a sinister motivation, in both of those ways that I just described. Turn hearts away from the true God, toward idolatry, toward us or some other deity, and then work these things, influence people to use these things in such a way that they destroy themselves, either through violence and bloodshed or immorality, and they destroy their children, themselves, their families, the social structure. All these things get laid at the feet of the forces of darkness. And of course, the New Testament talks about this as well, that we have, we wrestle not with flesh and blood, and against principalities and powers and all these things. So the New Testament, of course, has this sense that people are what they are, and the culture is what it is, and our circumstances are what they are, at least in part, because we have, spiritual forces of darkness that are working against us, to try to produce chaos and to try to, keep us from the family of God. So the New Testament theology is really no different than that. It's just that the Second Temple material really focuses on the Watchers, and then those threads get picked up in the New Testament in certain passages. But I don't see any indication that they were initially thought to be, just benefactors in a real, in a manner consistent with godliness.
Okay. Yeah, that's actually really helpful. The second question I had was on this footnote that you had in Reversing Herman, where you said that, if I summarize it correctly, that essentially anything that doesn't have the divine nature is by definition not perfect. And I think you went on to infer that humanity's sin was more or less necessary because of that, like we were going to sin by necessity. And I was curious if you could go into more detail on that. And I provided two little thoughts there to bounce off of.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd use. It'd be actually nice if I could read what I actually wrote here. Did you type any of it out, or are you summarizing there?
Would you like me to read it out, the footnote?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have a copy here.
All right, I have it. I have Reversing Herman right here. Just opening it up. So footnote 185 says, while we'll see her statement, this is about Brand, statement about the link between human sinfulness and demons, i.e. the fallen watchers, is correct, Brand overstates the dichotomy between the two perspectives about sin. She elsewhere claims that, quote, the attribution of sin to demons renders moot the question of why humans were created with sinful desires, unquote. It doesn't. There is no reason to suspect that Second Temple Jews did not believe true. She also fails to consider the Genesis 3 narrative that humans were created imperfect, basically lesser than God and without his nature. By definition, any being lacking the nature of God himself will sin. And that's the end of the footnote.
Yeah. So what was the question based on that then? Could you you have here, could you give a little more detail on this?
Yeah, and the two thought experiments that I have on this is the dumb one, which is to say things like rocks and plants, they don't have the nature of God, but they also don't sin. That's the dumb one. And then the less dumb one would be, in the new creation, presumably we would also be sinless. But even under like the strongest view of theosis, I don't think that we would have the same nature as Yahweh. So
Yeah, I would.
little
Yeah, I would agree with the second one there. I mean, all that we can really say is that we are made as perfect as we can be without, again, being transformed into Yahweh himself, or the Son himself. We will be like him, as it says in 1 John and other places. So the implication of that is that we are still, not God himself. And so, is it in theory possible that rebellion could burst forth in a new Eden? That sort of thing. I think, to be honest, we have to allow that possibility, even though the New Testament, I don't think really, says anything directly to that. But if we are going to be consistent, and I do think we have to be, any being that is not God himself is therefore lesser. Who isn't God by nature, lesser. And so if he is the absolute standard of perfectibility and we don't meet that standard, then in theory, something could go wrong again, that rebellion could occur. Having said that, though, as glorified humans, we are also more, I think we will be much more than what Adam and Eve were. And so it makes this possibility extraordinarily unlikely. Like I tell George Norrie on Coast to Coast, when he says, "It's possible, Mike, isn't it? Isn't it possible?" I said, "Yeah, George, it's possible I could be the next American Idol, but I wouldn't lay any money on that." So, it's just one of those things that I think, to be honest, we have to say, we're not God, and we'll never be God. And so in theory, there's this possibility that something could go wrong. But the likelihood of that is so infinitesimal that, I would never expect it. Okay. I'm not going to be the next American Idol. It's just not going to happen. Even though in theory, we could say it could. So that's sort of how I categorize and classify that kind of thing. And so the comments about imperfection really stem from the fact that we are created like God. The rocks were not created like God. So it's really a comment directed at imagers, and you obviously know that.
Right.
We are created like him, but we are not him. And my comment about Brand is just saying, I don't think that she really, I know I don't have to say I think. I know nowhere in her book and her dissertation anyway, does she really, get into that and sort of understand that would have, been part of the picture for Israelites. Just by definition, they know they're not God, they're not perfect. He's the only, perfect being. So I think that has to be part of how we think about, the origin of evil. I like to try to separate origin of rebellion, Genesis 3 from the proliferation. That's how I think Genesis 6 was thought about in Second Temple literature. But scholars often use the word origin instead of proliferation, and Brand tends to do that and not be thinking too much about Genesis 3.
Okay, yeah, that's really helpful. So my last question is, which running back should I take in my fantasy team for this Sunday?
What are your choices?
I'm not exactly sure. I was thinking maybe someone from the Packers, but they're a bunch of hacks and really lame. So.
Go Pack. Are you a Bears fan?
No, actually, I'm a Carolina fan. I'm kind of a weirdo in that respect.
Well, it's too bad you didn't have Gurley. I did.
Yeah.
In the Naked Bible League. So Trey was very hesitant to talk about fantasy football yesterday on the podcast.
All right. Well, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and that's very helpful. So thanks so much for that.
Good. Well, I'm glad the content was useful too.
Yeah, that last mention of Adam and Eve, that we'll be beyond Adam and Eve. It reminds me of that question you received, Mike, on did Adam and Eve poop, and that became practically a meme overnight, because everyone in the comments were like, "This is a PhD scholar," and then he says, quote unquote, Mike says this, of course Adam and Eve pooped. It's just, yeah. So that's crazy.
Yeah.
So Krishna and Narcist, you're next, and your timer starts now.
All right. Yeah. Can y'all hear me?
Yep.
All right. Just making sure. Yes, it's a pleasure to meet you, Dr. Heiser. I got a few questions that I hope to get to. General, just keep me up track with the time, so that way I don't get carried away.
Yep.
So the first question I have is concerned. I'm sure you're familiar with this particular issue whenever you gave a lecture a while back, but like concerning the flat Earth stuff that you've said about the flat Earth cosmology that is mentioned in the ancient Near East back then. What would your advice be to the flat earthers who read or use your material? Just simply that knowing that that's just what they're doing with it.
Well, I would say they need to be honest, and while they're articulating the phenomena of the text, and if they're going to use my name to, I guess if they're doing that, it's going to be virtue by association. They need to be honest and not dishonest, and also inform people about how I think about such things. So, again, I'm not holding my breath that anybody's going to do that, but that's what I would want them to do.
All right. Next, I remember in a documentary you did, there was a piece where you briefly went over the issue about the Noah flood story and the claim that it was a plagiarism from the Epic of Gilgamesh. What are your thoughts on this particular claim? Is it true? And if not, like, what would you say would make the validity be proven for the flood story in Genesis?
People need to understand the difference between interacting with another text and plagiarism. There are significant differences as well, between the biblical account and Mesopotamian accounts. And by the way, Mesopotamian accounts aren't consistent with each other either. I mean, they're going to have differences between them. So it's one thing to be interacting with a flood story, at some point, and just, essentially copying something word for word, out of it. You don't have, and I don't know that anybody who's a scholar, says something as silly as the biblical writers copied, the text. They might say something like, "Oh, here's a flood story," and the biblical writers, kind of liked it, and so they made up their own version of it. And then they cribbed, content off, the Babylonian stuff. I mean, you might have somebody out there in the 19th century, they would say stuff like that. Now it's a little bit more sophisticated, or we're not cursed with pan-Babylonianism. Everything has to originate from Babylon and Mesopotamia. There are elements of the story that, are external, have external concerns, to Mesopotamian material. So it's evident that the biblical writer is not just copying, the story itself. That said, there are, I think, within the ancient Near Eastern world, and it's curious, that Egypt doesn't have, a flood story like this, which those who would take a regional view of the flood would find not too difficult to explain, because if it's a regional flood that covered, the Fertile Crescent, we'll say, up into Anatolia and whatnot, then that it would, you wouldn't expect the Egyptians to have one. So, given that, I think that the similarity also has to be due to sort of institutional memory or collective memory. In the Israelites' case, you're going to have a lot of this passed on by oral tradition. And the way I conceive of this in my mind, because I do think Genesis 1 through 11 is late. It's later than the Mosaic era. And I think that it's reflected by the heavy Babylonian orientation of lots of things in Genesis 1 to 11. So my conception of this is that during the exile, we've already had codified the stories of the ancestors, the Israelites, that they had, been passing down. And I think, again, to me, it's not a stretch to say that they had also passed down creation and flood stories. And so then they take that material that they had sort of quote unquote grown up with, that they've passed around, again, part of collective memory, and then they begin to use that and interweave it with the Mesopotamian material, both to sort of create their own version, but also to be consistent with, again, this thing that everybody in the region would have remembered, their ancestors would have talked about, this great flood. So again, that's the way I look at it. I think we have to account for similarity. I think we have to account for difference. There are places in Genesis 1 through 11 that it is very evident that the writer of the Hebrew material is looking at a Mesopotamian text, because they'll mimic things like the syntax, and they'll change a little bit of an element, to make a particular point, or that they stick to it closely enough that it guides our interpretation of the Hebrew material. I'm thinking about the syntax, for instance, in Genesis 1 through 3. It's very similar to the beginning of Enuma Elish, and if we honor that similarity, then that influences the way we read the first 3 verses, grammatically and syntactically. So all of that kind of stuff is going on. I think that the picture that in the popular mind about copying flood stories is far too simplistic. It's evident that they were exposed to that, but that's not all they're doing. So in a nutshell, that's how I would say it. Yeah, they're using these texts. They had access to them, the scribes, but what they're doing is not just some simplistic copying it down. Hey, turn the page, I got to finish that sentence. What did they say? That kind of thing. It's just more complex than that.
All right. Next question. Whenever we use the phrase of the ego eimi, the I am statement Jesus uses of himself, we use this as at least normally we use this as the proof text to point out to Jesus being divine or such whenever he says the words that before Abraham was I am. Recently I've heard an objection from some Muslims that in the same way Moses had spoke as if he was God by saying he would do this certain thing that seems to be only something that only God did. I forget exactly the verse. General, I told you about it once. I don't know, maybe you can help.
You could be thinking of Exodus 7 or something, like 7:1 or something. Like Moses is the Elohim.
Well, not just that. It's something that Moses, I think it's in Deuteronomy, where Moses says is speaking to the Israelites or to his people, and is saying something to them. In the middle of it, he starts acting like he's God and such, or so speaks as if God without saying, and then the Lord saith. But anyways, they use this to say that Jesus is simply a prophet who was being God's mouthpiece in the same way that Moses was, and isn't really claiming to be God. I don't know if General can figure the verse out on that, but if you're familiar with it, or just familiar with the concept, what would you say to that kind of argumentation?
I need to know what they're actually referring to. I mean, just generally, it's like the deity of Christ does not depend on the ego eimi statements. So I would okay, well, let's take them off the table. Now let's look at these other 12, 15, 20 things. I sort of disagree with the premise that seems to be floating around in the Muslims' head that if we can't talk about the ego eimi statements, then we undermine the deity of Jesus. Well, that's kind of silly, actually, but without knowing specifically what they're referring to, I don't know that I could comment on it.
All right. Well, okay, I still got several others then. So, oh yeah, here it is. So you've talked about the two powers in heaven view before, but also the one thing that I want to know is that along with back then in Jewish thought, was there a view that concerned a concept of like a comparison to the New Testament Holy Spirit? Like, was there any sort of Holy Spirit view that the Jews in the Old Testament or any time in Judaism shared?
Yeah, you do get a little bit of that, and typically it's interchanging God doing or saying something, in rhetorically speaking here, in one breath, and then somewhere else in the same passage, the Spirit will sort of fill that slot. So you get a little bit of those sorts of things, both in the Old Testament and in Second Temple literature. And you get these places where if you sort of know the motifs associated with the two powers, and you see them somewhere, but then instead of the anthropomorphized Yahweh, we get the Spirit sort of occupying that space or playing that role. You get some of those things in both, like I said, the Old Testament and Second Temple literature. The guy who's written, I think, most. Let's see here if I can remember how to spell his name properly. Let's see. I'm going to look it up quick here on Amazon. I don't know if it's Levinson or Levison or, let's see. Oh, my search engine's letting me down here. I should probably just look it up in my Divine Council bibliography, but let me just take one more stab at Amazon here. Yeah, his name's not coming up. Let's try first century.
Hey, Christian anarchist, was it Deuteronomy 32 called the Song of Moses?
Could you repeat it?
All right, I found the book here. The Spirit in First Century Judaism by Levison, Levison. And he has some articles too. But he goes through the material about specifically the Spirit in the Dead Sea Scrolls and Philo of Alexandria. And it's stuff like this, where in the Old Testament, the inner direction of a person, okay, is said to be sort of like influenced by God. And God will get credited for the person doing or being a certain, positive thing. And then you'll find some of those texts used in first century texts, Second Temple Jewish texts, where it really doesn't sort of focus on God, the quote unquote Father, but it's actually the Holy Spirit that performs the same roles or tasks. And so Levinson's book is just his research is talking about this sort of swapping in and out of the Spirit with God, and the effect that would have had on sort of deifying the Spirit, making the Spirit occupy the same space. So you get some of that in the literature. My thing is, for New Testament writers, is I don't know if you remember from Unseen Realm, but as the anthropomorphized Yahweh, as the visible Yahweh, the second Yahweh figure is but isn't God, and then all that gets moved over, and Jesus gets put into that second slot. So as Jesus is but isn't the Father, the Spirit is but isn't Jesus. So the New Testament writers will link the Spirit. They will interchange the Spirit with Jesus, and they'll also interchange the Spirit with God Himself. And so that telegraphs this idea that, again, as the central figure, Jesus is but isn't the Father, then the Spirit is but isn't Jesus. And if He is Jesus, Paul says a couple times, the Lord who is the Spirit, stuff like that. And Spirit of Christ will be interchanged with Spirit of God. So if the Spirit is linked to Jesus, and Jesus is certainly a deity figure, because He's also the Father, He is but isn't the Father, then the Spirit has to be God as well. And this is actually where you see triunity and Trinitarian thinking come from. But the component parts of that you will find here and there in Second Temple texts, and even a little bit with the Spirit, with respect to the Spirit in the Old Testament. So you get a more fuller articulation of it in the New Testament, precisely because of the incarnation. Again, occupying that center role, the number two slot of the three, if you think of them on a vertical pole. You get a more a better sense of the triunity idea in the New Testament because of Jesus himself. But you can't say that the pieces are unique, because the pieces exist in other places. It's just you get this sort of, not formulation, that'd be the wrong word, but you get more development of the thinking of the picture in the New Testament.
Okay, thanks. So see.
Oh, is that all the time?
Well,
I can stick around for what's left here.
I'll give you, like, Mike. How long do you have, Mike?
I'm good. I'm just here by
good?
myself.
Okay. So in this,
he's still keeping Nibiru at bay. He's waiting till we finish. Then I'll have to prop up his paws then, to keep it away. So.
Right. So Mike, in the side chat, you can see I posted the verse that CA was trying to get at, and that's Deuteronomy 29, verse 5 to 6. So CA, maybe if you want to come back and showcase the footnote that I put from a commentary saying you have a change in persons and so on. Yeah.
Well, if there is a change in person, I mean, the note you put in here sort of answers the question. So how can it be Moses if it's the Lord?
Right. The claim by so we actually had a discussion with a Muslim that basically said, oh, look, here's an example where Moses is speaking, and then suddenly he says, I am the Lord your God that did this. It was a bit sloppy, and so what I did was I looked at a few of the commentaries, like this one, the Expositor's Bible Commentary, and clearly in the footnote it says, well, there's an abrupt change in person indicates that these verses are spoken by the Lord. But I was looking at some other commentaries, like I think the Anchor Yale commentary says that it could actually be Moses speaking on behalf of God, like, and so maybe CA is wanting closure on that. Like, what's the best way of reading that?
I think either is a possibility. Deuteronomy, again, some of this is reflective of what one thinks about the authorship of Deuteronomy. If you take a phrase, let's just look it up here. Do this real quickly. Close it in quotation marks here. Oh, let's see here. No, we're not going to find the New Testament, so let's do this right. So you have the phrase "I am the Lord your God" shows up a bunch of times, over 40 times, and so someone who would, you don't have to be a source critic. Again, I'm what used to be called a supplementarian. That I don't think all of the 5 books of the Torah were written at the same time or by the same person. Even though I believe in a Mosaic core to what we identify as the Pentateuch, and I think JEDP is, again, a lot of circular reasoning there. But anyway, if you have this phrase exist prior to the writing of Deuteronomy, and then you have someone fashioning Deuteronomy 29, and they word the text the way it's worded, where Moses is talking and he says, I am the Lord your God. They're going to assume that their readership is going to know that phrase exists somewhere else, and they're going to assume that their readership knows who the speaker is. So it can exist as it is. You don't have Moses claiming to be deity, but what you have is whoever wrote or edited the text is just operating under the assumption that people will know what's being referenced. The earlier, really it's the Exodus. It occurs in Exodus 6, for instance. And most people, who are source critics would certainly say Exodus existed prior to Deuteronomy, but you have a bunch of other ones too. Exodus 16 is another, and again, it's very, very close to the same time, but the phrase itself is linked to the deliverance from Egypt. So I am the Lord your God. Everybody's going to know because it occurs so much, and it's connected specifically with the deliverance, from bondage, that they're going to know what it refers to. So I don't think that's a long way of saying that an Israelite, a Jewish reader, is not going to be reading this text and think like a Muslim, like a 21st century Muslim. They're going to know where the phrase originates from, and they're not going to be confused by it. But like the commentator that you posted, you could certainly argue that as well.
And so just quickly, Mike, is the New International Version, like even the 2011 edition, it actually starts by saying, "Yet the Lord says" in verse 5. But obviously that's not in the Hebrew text. And so and emphasize that it is God speaking, as you see in verse 6. But so is it Moses speaking? Or
does the NIV have that in italics? I'm just wondering what the NIV does to indicate
no
translation.
No, it literally
That's
has capital Lords there. Yeah.
I don't even know if I have NIV 2011. I'm trying to. That's not today's NIV, is it?
No. The NIV, yeah. The 2011. I mean, if I go to the 1984 one,
yeah,
it doesn't have
what's the
it.
1984 one do?
The 1984 doesn't have it, but the 2011 does.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, well, that would be a translator decision. If there's no, I'm going to look up. I have something called SESB here to see if they have a note here, if there's any textual validation to that. That's interesting. So this is talking about verse 5 in English. And 1984 says, this is the NIV 1984, during the 40 years I led you through.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So
the Hebrew text
has
the Hebrew text has at least what the SESB has a critical apparatus, and so that's showing and I said. So it's not an and he said. But if the translator was looking at that and I said, and then again noting the earlier places where this same phrase has shown up, I'm trying to be generous here. Could I don't need to be generous to the NIV translators, but I'm just wondering. I'm wondering on what basis they made the decision. And it may have been something like that. They may have thought that legitimates what they're doing, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I was serving a lot of translations, and it seemed to have been literally just this one.
Net Bible has. Did you look up Net Bible on that?
I forget. Let me just check Net.
Yeah, they don't have it. They don't have anything there either. Yeah.
Yeah, Net doesn't have it.
And which was the commentary that you posted the note from?
So this is the Expositor's Bible Commentary by Earl S. Carland.
Mm-hmm.
But the Net Bible does have a footnote that says the Septuagint reads that He is the Lord your God.
Yeah.
In verse 6. So instead of saying that I, because again, there's this notion of if Moses is speaking, it's like interesting that the Septuagint like changes the I to a he.
Yeah, well, you get stuff like that a lot. Yeah. That's at 29:6.
Right.
Again, trying to be generous to the NIV translator here. I obviously don't know who this was, but it could be again that they're taking. That's really interesting. Because I could see where somebody could look at the Septuagint. Okay, he is the Lord your God, and maybe think that there's justification for changing the beginning on the basis of that. I don't know. It's hard to know what they're thinking. It's in Tige in his Deuteronomy commentary. I just looked him up here. He says here, Moses speaks for God as in 28:20 and elsewhere. As in 8:2-4, God reminds Israel his providence in the Lord has had educational purposes. So if you go to 8, 2 and 4, and this is a good point on Tige's part, there are going to be places in Deuteronomy that take the same material where there is no quote unquote, confusion. And so it's very easy to re-reference those places. And I was referring, to other parts of the Torah, but here Tige has an example, right from Deuteronomy, where again the reader's going to know what's going on. They're going to know that Moses is mouthing the words of God and not claiming to be God. So I'm not under any delusion that's going to satisfy a Muslim, apologist. But again, people who are reading through the text, especially, closely, aren't going to be confused by it. Right. Now I'm really interested as to why the NIV did what they did. Yeah, I don't have a copy of that, the 2011 version.
Right, and I guess just to close on this point, in the Naked Bible Facebook group, I've been sharing a new translation that has been done by scholars who actually worked on the NIV, the ESV, and the NASB. So people like Peter Flint, David Allen Black, Gleason Archer, most of them have actually died now. But it's called the ISV.
David's still alive. we
no,
don't want to bury David.
David's still alive. Yeah, but I was
sorry, David, if you're listening.
I was saddened to find out that David Allen, not David, Peter Flint passed away last December. So, yeah. But in the ISV, they actually, they do, it's the first English translation that actually renders Nakash as the Shining One in Genesis 3. And,
I wonder, do you know who did Genesis?
Yeah. I think it was a female Japanese Hebrew scholar. That's all I know. I forgot her name, but it was a female that.
It's not Annette Yashiko Reed, is it? I mean, she's first century and Second Temple, specifically Enoch stuff, but
right.
She'd certainly have the chops to do it.
That sounds familiar. That name. When I was looking through the
when you say Japanese and Hebrew, I only think of two people. She's one of them.
Yeah, she's definitely Asian. That's for sure. Like I remember I looked up the name, and I saw an Asian face, and I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting.
Oh boy,
so,
if I run into her at SBL, I have a good question to ask. Were you the one that did the ISV of Genesis? Are you sworn to secrecy?
Yeah. So, okay. So I guess I'll spend my 10 minutes now.
Okay.
Now, so Mike, I became a Christian in 2009, and I came across your work in 2011, and I came across other ministries like Hugh Ross, Reasons to Believe. So currently, I'm a master's. I'm doing a master's in engineering and physics.
Mm-hmm.
I have a high value for academia, also in the sciences, and peer review and the scientific method and so on. And so I really value all aspects of academia, so especially your scholarship, in this case, the engineeries, the Second Temple stuff, and then outside that, the physical sciences. So someone like Hugh Ross, I highly admire as one who maintains a strong focus on that. I was astonished to discover that, first and foremost, someone like Hugh Ross, when he looks at Genesis 1, he has a very hard concordance approach. And it was appealing. But when I came across you through the Zitchen stuff, and just to preface that, the reason why I came across you is because my uncle was basically trying to push down the whole Zitchen thing, and that stuff was just crazy, and I was looking for someone that would debunk it. And lo and behold, I came across your work, specifically, zitcheniswrong.com, and so yeah, long story short, I noticed that you did make statements about Genesis 1 as an ancient Near Eastern cosmology. I looked at John Walton's work through that, and then it became apparent that this is the case. This is how people were thinking. Curiously, when I look at, like, say, Basil the Great Church, he would like go against the flow of that solid dome type argument. But it's interesting to see that the cosmology, continued on into first century Christianity. But my question is, in light of that, concordism and an ancient Near Eastern cosmology, and the reason why I ask that is because even in Unseen Realm, you make the point that there are things mentioned in Scripture, like in the Old Testament, that, for example, Paul in Ephesians 3 will say, only now has this revelation been revealed. The secret has been revealed. Like, for example, when Matthew uses Hosea 11, he's concording. So Hosea 11 is not giving a prophecy about Jesus, but Matthew is concording with the present circumstance of Jesus going to Egypt, and he's the Son of God. And so there's a parallelism that where the text can be used in a dual way. And so, is it possible that Genesis 1, God in his omniscience, he'll know that soon the church will progress into a scientific context, and that the text can be engineered through his providential vision, that the text can speak to both an ancient Near Eastern audience as well as a modern 21st century evolutionary audience? Is that possible?
Well, I think that's, I don't know how else to say this, but I think that's why my approach is the best one. Because if it's if what's written in Scripture is not tethered to a scientific worldview, if it's not designed to give us science, it transcends science. So what you have is you have different ways of talking about some things that are fundamentally the same. Who created us? Why are we here? Just these big picture questions. So, I mean, you don't get concordism out of that, but it's certainly possible that if Scripture itself, if the truth claims of the text transcend a particular body of scientific knowledge, then of course it can speak to an ancient person as well as a 21st century person. The key with that, or the trick with that, however you want to say it, is to recognize what is the truth proposition being claimed, and what is the conduit through which it is being claimed. What is the means by which it is being claimed. And my position is that the truth claims are not the solid firmament, that we have water above the earth, and that's, God actually lives there. Like if we penetrated the dome, we'd actually see God. I don't think heaven has latitude and longitude, or even, in terms of a celestial globe, you can plot out God's location and all that sort of stuff. I don't think that has anything to do with it. So the truth propositions, as I see the issue, are who is responsible for all these things: human accountability, human origins, our relationship to the Creator, all these sort of big picture questions. There's a certain set of truth propositions that we are asked to believe, that we need to affirm. And then there are the ways of expressing those things. And those are secondary. They're just conduits through which the truth proposition flows. So if you take that view, the mode of expression, again, doesn't bind us to seeing the mode of expression as the truth assertion being proposed. And if we make that separation, and we understand what the truth propositions are as opposed to the vehicle by which they are communicated, then the stuff in Genesis should, by definition, and I would say by the wisdom of God, because I think God did this intentionally. I think Scripture intentionally, Genesis intentionally, is not designed to teach us a body of science knowledge. It's intentionally, again, not tied to those things, because God did know that humans would be like him and find out what makes the earth tick. They would be curious. They would do investigation. They would do science. They would seek to fill their curiosity. I think God knew all these things. And so the way to make that not matter, if you will, is to not tether these things together. And so, that's just the approach I take. So I think, of course, what the content of Genesis should be able to speak to both audiences. And the reverse of that is if we're going to view Genesis as ultimately teaching us a body of science, well, then ultimately its meaning was lost until we get to the 20th century. Like people, there's no way that a primitive person or an ancient person could have known, most of this material if it's really secretly teaching us about chemistry and biology and evolution and physics and whatnot. I think that is just I think it's a deeply flawed approach, even though what it produces isn't going to be flawed. Again, because ultimately people who do that are still going to go back to the same things that I say are the truth propositions anyway. So I don't think it's something that to be terribly concerned about. I certainly don't view Hugh Ross as a black hat. Hugh Ross is definitely a white hat. He's a good guy to boot. But I just don't think that the approach to Scripture is I don't think it's accurate. I don't think it's the way we should approach these things. But I don't think it's harmful. I think it's unnecessary at the end of the day. But that's just my perspective on it. And John, of course, Walton is going to share a lot of that too. But communicative power, absolutely. That's what I would say it's designed to communicate across bodies of scientific knowledge because it's not tethered to any one of them. 1,000 years from now, you'd have the same problem. If we wrote Genesis today and we let Stephen Hawking do it or Hugh Ross do it, 1,000 years from now, people are going to be looking at that and go, can you believe that they actually thought this? This is so primitive. This is just so backward. Because they're going to be more advances. And so I think God was extraordinarily wise and far-seeing, as he is capable of being. And from the very get-go, this was not about giving us a specific body of scientific knowledge, because God knew it would change. If you untether it, the truth propositions never change. The science changes, but the truth propositions do not. And so I look at this as a wise act of God to not do what a lot of Christians think he's done in Genesis.
Right. I guess just quickly, because I guess you could say I have an OCD on the scientific perspective of things, and because in fact, that's my grounding. I've been brought up in that environment, and what I decided to do is I wanted to survey, say, the last 2,000 years of commentary. So, for example, Basil in the 4th century asked a curious question about verse 20 in Genesis, where the birds derive from the oceans. And then he says, well, does this mean that the birds and fish have a relationship? Then you fast forward to John Calvin, and John Calvin says in his Genesis commentary that come out of the waters, but unfortunately this verse is used by skeptical men to denounce the faith because they laugh at the idea that birds would derive from the oceans, from the organisms in the oceans. Mm-hmm. Then you fast forward to someone like Philip Schaff, the historian, who, the Ante-Nicene Father material, that translation. And curiously, he has a footnote under Basil's quote saying, "Oh, now because of Darwin, the link between birds and fish is evident." And so that's where I'm wondering. Like you make a brilliant point that the message of Genesis in a concordant sense is lost for 20 centuries. But curiously, when you read the Genesis commentaries, like in this case John Calvin, they were basically saying, we look forward to the day when science can explain or would finally agree with this passage. After Darwinism, now there's like a concordance approach, with verse 20. How would you react to that?
Specifically in verse 20, I don't think it's a good reading to have the birds deriving from the waters.
Sorry. This would be the Septuagint. Sorry, not the master text.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and again, as the case with the Septuagint, maybe there is something in the Hebrew text the translator was using that merits, the treatment that he gives it. Other times, the Septuagint translator could just not handle something so well. So, it could be one or the other. But I would say in general, I think there are things in Genesis that, again, with our body of knowledge, we look at and, wonder about the language. And we, of course, can parse a scientifically consistent meaning out of the language, and then we'd say, wow, that was, there was really something in there in the text, that sort of telegraphed this point way before the fact, and it doesn't get in the way of earlier readers, getting meaning from the text. I think you could, in theory, have a couple of those. My problem with it is I don't think it can work across the board with the sciences. Especially like cosmology with the dome and all that stuff. So biologically, all of the examples I've seen of this are biological. And they are sort of they sort of crop up because they're part of the discussion of biological evolution. But I don't think you're really going to be able to take that tack again in other areas of science. So I think you might find points that you can use to have a conversation, with someone who might be using these verses, to laugh at scripture and whatnot. But I think it's way too optimistic to think that you'll be able to pull the same thing off in other areas of science. So I don't know that matters, one way or the other. It's just it's a suspicion or a skepticism that I have. But at the same time, if you have something like that, the point that you would be trying to make out of it in a conversation with an evolutionist friend, that the point might still be legitimate, that the text doesn't necessarily stand in the way of our knowledge here at that point. But again, I'd be cautious to not press it too far, because you're gonna run into something else that you're going to have to appeal to ignorance for. Well, maybe someday we'll know how this works out, and that's not going to really satisfy an atheist evolutionist. So I would be careful with it, but at the same time, I acknowledge there could be some of those things in there, but they're just other areas of science. I don't think that we're going to be able to do that with.
No, I really appreciate that insight, Mike, because it's kind of like saying, I'm a Calvinist Arminian. So I'm an engineerist and accommodationist, and I have one foot in concordism and one foot in accommodationism, and yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well,
but Mike,
again, this is not going to be anything that you don't know, but maybe listeners down the road. I mean, I just look at if God is picking people to write this thing we call the Bible, God is fully aware of what he's getting. He knows who he's picking. He knows when they live. He knows what they know and what they don't know. And he makes these choices. And he uses them to produce material. He doesn't download the information into their heads. He doesn't give them advanced scientific knowledge. He doesn't turn off their brains and then, insert the material and wake them up and then they realize they've written something. Okay, he doesn't do that. He uses people. And he lets people do what they do. And my view is that he has providentially, he knew who he was going to choose. He has providentially prepared the people that he does choose for the task that he gives them, and then puts them in a certain time and place, and then they do the job. And he does that not only for the writers that we know, but he does it for the writers we don't know, and he does it with every hand that ever touched the text to produce the final product that we call Scripture, that we call the Bible, that we assign inspiration to. So God knew all the way along. God knows what he's doing. And when we read things in the text that are, primitive in nature when it comes to scientific knowledge, God is not surprised by that. It's there because of the choices God made. And that should inform us that had God cared to give us exhaustive, precise scientific knowledge, he would have either picked somebody else or he would have turned off their brains and just did the job himself. But he doesn't do that. It doesn't reflect what we actually see in scriptures. So that in turn tells me that what's really important to God are the truth propositions contained in the text. What are the things that emerge from what we read that God would really want us to believe? What's it about? What's the passage about? What are we supposed to learn? About God and his world and about ourselves, just things like that. So I tend to operate on some pretty simple presuppositions, but because they're simple, I don't think that's their weakness. I actually think it's their strength, that we're allowing God to make choices and we honor those choices. And if we think about the choices God does make, that helps us understand the choices he didn't make. And we can, come out with a view that says, again, as opposed to concordism, that the content of the scientific knowledge was incidental. What he's really after here is to tell us about himself and who we are and the plans that he has for humanity. The big picture sorts of things. So that's the way I look at it. Again, I don't think that the simplicity of it is the weakness. I actually think it's the strength, and I think it allows us to deal with the phenomena of the text as we have it. Because if we take these download and mind dumps and maybe the uber concordist positions, it might look fine from one perspective, but we're going to run into something that's really problematic because of those particular assumptions that we bring to the text. So we set traps for ourselves by doing this. But I know why we do it, and I don't think the people that do it are doing something wrong. I don't think that at all. I think it's in the case of concordism, I think it's a bit misguided and unnecessary. But at the end of the day, again, I'll use Hugh Ross for an example. Hugh Ross is a wonderful guy, and he's faithful. He's brilliant. He tries to bring every thought captive, and what can you say about somebody like that? He's going to get to heaven, and God will say, "Well done." He won't get a lesson on why he shouldn't have been a concordist. God's going to look at him and say, "Good job."
Right.
You did the job.
Yeah. I mean, the amount of bibliography my goodness. He even has a full-page, a full-document fine-tuning list of over 1,000 different fine-tuning parameters, coming from a scientist's context with like at least 1,500.
Well, I had lunch
wow.
with Hugh once, and actually it was dinner, and so I asked him, so what do you do? What's your week like? And he has his time parceled out through the the rules of the boards set by the the board of the nonprofit, and he had, I'm trying to remember what the percentage was. He said, I can devote 40% of my time to research. And he said but we had to hire people who could do research full time. And then he explained to me what it's like in your world, the hard sciences world with journals. And he said, we've got dozens of journals that every week each one of them will put out 400 or 500 pages of research. He goes, it's impossible to keep up with that stuff. He goes, I do only astronomy and astrophysics, and he's looking through the stuff with an eye, for the fine tuning stuff and stuff that's useful, for what he's trying to accomplish. And he goes, but we have somebody else tasked with biology. We got somebody else tasked with chemistry. It's just impossible to keep up with the journal literature. He goes, but we do the best we can. And he said, that's why, he actually brought this up. He said, that's why we can post something on the site every day that's new, that's current about, fine tuning and things like that, because we have people that most of their job is just going through the journal literature. And I
can definitely vouch for that. Yeah.
I mean, in theological studies, we've got a few dozen journals that we all want to try to keep up with, or at least keep an eye on, but they'll only publish something 4 times a year, or something like. It's not every week. I mean, it's just I couldn't imagine, and I still can't. The amount of material that's produced in the hard sciences is just staggering. we don't have anything like that in biblical studies. It's just nowhere close.
Thanks, Mike. And so we have Faithful in here, and I think what we'll do is so Faithful, if you can just ask one question, and I think Mike, your time's coming to an end for you. So
sure.
I mean, I'm obviously we're the thing is, let's be transparent here. We'd all love you, to continue this discussion for like probably the next 4 hours or something, but we have to respect your time. So.
Yeah, I do have other things to do.
Yeah. Ask your question and.
All right, thank you, my brother. Hey, Dr. Heiser, I'm a huge fan of yours. I just had a quick question. So I kind of wanted to get your insight on the scholarly consensus on, bad books such as the Jesus Mysteries. There seems to be people out there who like to use those sort of books to attack Christianity, and we're having an influx of those people now who are starting to use that sort of material. So I really wanted to get your insight on that.
Well, to be honest with you, most of that kind of stuff is ignored in the Academy in Biblical Studies, unfortunately. When it comes, like on my website for recommended reading, I have a number of books, and they're not all by Christians either, that address Jesus myth or arguments. So there are people who step up and write about those things, again, because they care about the subject matter. Again, like I said, some of these people aren't even believers, like Maurice Casey. I think he's an atheist or an agnostic. But in fact, in Casey's book, he actually does hit on Freak's material, Freak and Gandhi, a little bit of that. He's actually pretty widely read in the Jesus myth stuff, but most of the other response books cast a wider net. They're not focused necessarily on specific books, and honestly, Casey's not either. Because he wants to stick with particular topics. So it gets addressed. It doesn't get addressed as much as I would like, but what's out there is pretty good. Again, go to my website, go to books, and then recommended reading, and you'll see the link to Jesus myth stuff. So I wish people were more engaged with it, but a lot of people just think it's so ridiculous that they don't care. They don't. Why would I either need to get tenure, so I need to crank out 2 or 3 articles this year, or I can go read Freak and Gandhi and rebut their book. Like nobody, it's obvious what they're going to choose there, especially if they're under pressure, to keep their job or to get a job. So yeah, I lament again that more people don't get involved, but the ones who have gotten involved, they produce some good stuff. You'll also find stuff that is peripheral, not directly taking on Jesus myth stuff, but on any given topic that's in one of these books. There's good journal material out there. So even if people aren't directly shooting at that, there's still a lot that can be drawn on to rebut, what they're doing. This is kind of like ancient astronaut stuff for me. If the 19th and early 20th centuries hadn't happened, the Jesus myth movement would probably die like the ancient astronaut movement would die, because they're just recycling old scholarship and sort of horses that have been dead for a long time, things like the Aryan Christ and all this sort of stuff. And they come across this stuff and they think they've discovered something wonderful and new that no one's ever looked at before. Well, actually, nobody's saying this anymore because 80 years ago somebody wrote a book or an article that just destroyed it. But they either don't know that material exists or they're not telling you. But somebody has to ferret all that out in a response book, and it takes a lot of work, a lot of time, and most scholars will just say it's just not worth my time, which is unfortunate. But some have really done some good work here, so we're not entirely without contribution.
All right, thanks, folks. Thank you, Dr. Michael Heiser, for joining us. It's now it's reaching 2 hours, and I think you've been very gracious for that. And the Lord bless you and keep you, and especially with your new projects. I think Lexham is releasing a book on angels, is it?
Yeah, I'm supposed to turn in the manuscript a week from today, so I'm still on schedule. I haven't managed to mess that up. So I don't know how long that will take. It depends on. I think it's going to really depend on who they get to be the content editor.
Right.
I have a hope there, but I don't know who will actually get tasked with that. So yeah, we'll see. But that one will be, the manuscript should be done a week from today, and maybe in the summer, maybe next summer it'll show up. But who knows? That's just a total guess off the top of my head.
And do you like? Have you seen my attempt, a hobby attempt at your first episode of the Acts commentary on your podcast, where I did some graphics for it?
No, I haven't. Did you send me the link, or did you send Trey the link, or?
I sent it to the Naked Facebook group, but everyone was. But so maybe what I'll do is
What kind of graphics did you do?
Well, you'll have to see it for yourself.
Okay, that's a fair answer.
Yeah. Just as a side hobby, what I do is I work on emulation. So I don't know if you remember the old GameCube, Nintendo GameCube back in 2001. So computers these days are powerful enough to emulate literally the hardware and basically in software. All Star Wars games, I retexture to make it look like as if it's a modern game. And so I thought, you know what? While I do my physics and my math and my hobbies, and when I work out at the gym and listening to the podcast, I think to myself, I should just devote myself to out and making graphic content. So and I would like to do it for free, basically. So and it's actually helped a lot of people. So
all right, now this is going to be an awkward question here, but if I go into the Facebook group, I should be able to just find this, or how would I find it?
What I'll have to do is
direct URL or anything, is there? Or
I
is
will.
There?
If I post a comment like literally within the next 10 minutes, and I tag your name, you will see the video link, and then you just click it and you can watch it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I'll do that.
And Steve McRae, he runs what's called the Great Debate Community. He's actually going to have Hugh Ross on the 26th in a few days. So he's basically saying, would Heiser like to say hi to Hugh on the 26th? So yeah, that's only if you're free. You can join the panel.
Yeah, well, good luck with that.
Right.
No, I'm serious. I'm just looking at the calendar here. This is October. Oh yeah, I'm actually going to be at the at Chuck Missler's last I've never been to one, so
oh wow,
I'm actually going to be at a conference event then. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and the 26th is the travel day to get there. So.
Okay.
Yeah, so that I can pretty well safely predict that that'll be a no. I'll go out on a limb.
Sorry, Steve. Yeah.
But you could tell Hugh I said hi. I talked to him a year ago at his booth, so it just, I see him typically in November if I see him at all.
Yeah, I remember you on the panel with Richard Hoagland, and you were like, okay, let me moderate for a while, because the moderator just wasn't doing a good job.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah. That was interesting.
So, okay, we'll go offline now. Thanks a lot, Dr. Michael Heiser, and everyone outside. I hope you've enjoyed this.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
God bless.
Bye-bye.